Hello and welcome to Wild Old Times, a podcast about the strange and curious sides of Ireland and Irish history. My name is Ciaran Conliffe, and on this episode I'll be telling you what University College Cork found under their floorboards. UCC is one of Ireland's oldest and most prestigious universities. It was founded in 1845 under a charter from Queen Victoria that made it one of 3 Queen's Universities in Ireland, alongside sister facilities in Dublin and Belfast. Understandably, Belfast is the only one of them to keep the Queen's University name. The university in Cork became part of the National University of Ireland under its new name in 1908. Taoiseachs, bishops, famous actors and musicians have all graduated from UCC over the years. Too many to list here. Its academics have been equally lofty. The university's first professor of mathematics was George Boole, who invented Boolean algebra, one of the fundamental building blocks of modern computer programming. And in 1910, the university made history when it appointed Mary Ryan as the first female professor in either Ireland or Great Britain. One of the more mysterious incidents in the university's history was in 1862, when the west wing of the quad caught fire. At this time, the wing hosted the chemistry, pathology and pharmacology departments, though the word pharmacology didn't yet exist, so it was known as the Materia Medica department. On the morning of May 15th, as dawn broke over the university, people noticed a large column of smoke coming out of the building. When a group led by University President Robert Kane entered the building, they discovered a fire burning in the specimen storage area, fueled by the alcohol used to preserve them. They also discovered evidence that someone had tried to start several other fires in the corridor. They quickly realized they had no hope of extinguishing the fire and retreated. The lack of anything like fire hydrants on the campus, and the fact that the building had been constructed without fire breaks, meant that all they could do was watch as it was completely destroyed. Sir Robert Kane had been the president of the university since it was founded 17 years earlier. He was known as the boy professor in his youth, publishing his first paper at the age of 19, discovering a new compound of manganese the following year, and becoming the professor of chemistry at the Apothecaries Hall in Dublin when he was only 22. He was 53 years old at this point in his career, and would remain UCC president for another 11 years. During his time in office, the university was mired in controversy. The Queen's colleges had been denounced by the papacy in 1847, though Cork were not quite so hated as Trinity College Dublin. When TCD began admitting Catholics in the 1870s, the Church responded by issuing a ban, to be enforced by bishops across the country, on Catholics attending the university. This ban was only lifted a century later in 1970. With all this tension, it's not surprising that the fire was initially blamed on Catholic extremists of some sort. There were other suspects, though. Some people thought it was an inside job and pointed the finger at various staff members with grievances. One professor even accused Sir Robert Kane himself, saying he had set the fire to distract from the controversy around his absentee president status. It was true that he did spend most of his time in Dublin, but the professor who accused him was still forced to resign in disgrace. The most bizarre suspect was Richard Burke, one of Cork's most infamous murderers. Burke was the clerk at the Waterford workhouse and had poisoned his wife to free himself to marry the workhouse schoolmistress. The evidence for this was an analysis of her stomach contents by Dr. John Blythe, Professor of Chemistry at UCC. Although Blythe had already completed his work, it was still thought the fire might have been set by an associate of John Burke to destroy the evidence. If so, they were wide of the mark, because after analysing the stomach, Blythe had already sent it off to Waterford. Burke was executed on the 25th of August in one of the last Irish public hangings. As for the fire, it was never discovered who had started it. All we can do is speculate. This shows that, like any big institution, UCC has a lot going on under the surface. In some cases, literally under the surface. Throughout the 40s, 50s and 60s, students in the pathology lecture theatre had a dead man under their feet. One who had died 23 centuries ago. To explain how he got there, we're going to have to talk a bit about Cork's history with African missionary work. The Society of African Missions is a Catholic organisation founded in 1856 by a man with an amazing name, Melchior Marie Joseph de Marion Bressilac. Although he died of yellow fever 3 years later during the Society's first mission to Sierra Leone, the SMA outlived him and is still going strong today. In 1876, Father James O'Hare set up an Irish outpost of the Society, an apostolic school in Cork that was intended to train people to become priests and then missionaries. In 1912, Ireland became the first independent province of the Society, meaning it was self-governing. At some point in the 1920s, the Irish branch of the SMA came into possession of a mummy. We don't know exactly how the mummy came to Cork. It was excavated from its tomb at some point in 1903 by the Italian Ernesto Schiaparelli. As well as being a prominent Egyptologist, he had also founded a society meant to support Italian missionaries in Egypt financially. That might have been how he became involved with the SMA. Schiaparelli is best known for 2 tombs he discovered. One was the tomb of Queen Nefertari, one of Ramses the Great's wives. The other was the tomb of Ka and Merit. This was the tomb of a foreman who supervised the construction of royal tombs, and is noteworthy because it's one of the few ancient Egyptian tombs we've discovered that was never previously found and robbed. As such, it's one of our best primary sources for how non-royals were buried. The mummy that wound up in Cork didn't come from any such prestigious tomb. Instead, it came from one of the dozens of others that Schiaparelli investigated. He found it and 3 others in a plundered tomb in the Valley of the Queens, a massive burial site near Luxor in Egypt. He was one of the first to explore this valley, which was called the Valley of the Queens because of the original idea that it was where the queens of the pharaohs were buried. The pharaohs themselves were buried in the Valley of Kings nearby. In fact, it seems that it was more broadly used, with princes, princesses, and priests being among those buried there. This is why our mummy was initially described as an Egyptian queen. We know now that this was wrong. The mummy is that of a man in his 40s or 50s. One of the more interesting things about the mummy is that it doesn't belong to the coffin that it arrived at Cork in. The coffin belongs to a man named Hor, who was a lotus bearer at the Temple of Amun. This seems to be a priest's title, though it's a rare one, and we don't know what it actually involved. The coffin was buried in a family tomb, and one of the other 3 found with it belonged to his brother Harwa. We're lucky that Schiaparelli photographed the coffin, as this was the only way researcher Helen Davis was able to link the coffin in Cork back to its discovery. Hor was buried sometime in the 6th or 7th century BCE, during the last 2 centuries of native Egyptian rule before they were conquered by the Persians. Schiaparelli's notes are a bit contradictory on what happened to the coffin, as he both claims it remained in Cairo and that he shipped it to the US. As we can tell, neither of these was what actually happened. The coffin belongs to Hor, but the body inside it is not his. The mummy was x-rayed in 1978, revealing that they were 5 feet 9 inches tall and probably male. They were well nourished, meaning they were in the middle or upper class, around 40 or 50 years old, and free of any obvious disease. Traditionally, a mummy inside a coffin would be covered in a layered shell made from linen and papyrus called a cartonnage. There is a cartonnage in the coffin, but it's broken into several pieces and we don't know if it belongs to the body. Thanks to the research of Helen Davis, we do know that it belongs to someone who died around 200 years after Hor. All of the pieces are in the style of the Ptolemaic period, the 4th or 5th century BC. The style of bandaging on the mummy is from the same era, which is how we know it doesn't belong to Hor. The chest of the cartonnage has a name, which is either Pachnum or Pesmedu, son of Tchmi. This might be the name of the mysterious body, or it might not. So what happened to Hor's body? The answer is probably somewhat depressing, and shows the complete lack of respect towards the bodies of ancient Egyptians. Started with 12th century Persians, who mistakenly believed that mummies blackened by age were actually tarred with bitumen, form of oil that oozed from the ground in the desert. The word mummy actually comes from the Persian word for bitumen, mumia. They also believed that bitumen had magical healing properties, an idea that dated back to the ancient Greeks. So when they could not get a hold of actual bitumen, they would dig up mummies, grind them up, and use them in medicine. As Persian writing spread westward through the Renaissance, so did the trade in the desecrated corpses of ancient Egyptians. The idea of powdered mummy as medicine persisted for centuries. Even someone like Robert Boyle, considered the father of modern chemistry, wrote in the 17th century that it was a useful medicine. Not everyone was so sold on the idea, though. Sir Thomas Browne, the most influential 17th century philosopher you've probably never heard of, described medicinal mummy as, quote, dismal vampirism that exceeds in horror the black banquet of Domitian, not to be paralleled except in those Arabian feasts wherein ghouls feed horribly. The most infamous use of mummies was not in medicine, but in art. Exactly when it started is disputed, but by the end of the 18th century, tubes of mummy brown were being sold in paint shops, and it was used by artists as well known as the president of London's Royal Academy, Benjamin West. West was known to take his colours very seriously, something which rebounded on him in 1796 in the scandal of the Venetian secret. This was when he bought an old manuscript about the painting and paint-making techniques of the Renaissance masters. He influenced several Academy members to start using the techniques, but he and they became laughingstocks when it was discovered the document was a forgery. Not everyone was okay with the use of human remains in painting. The artist Edward Burne-Jones had always thought Mummy Brown was just a name. When he found out what it was actually made from, he insisted on giving his supply of the colour a proper burial. Despite this, Mummy Brown continued to be a popular pigment throughout the 19th century, used by artists like Delacroix. His iconic painting of the July Revolution of 1830, Liberty Leading the People, is one of several famous works of art believed to use the pigment. So it's possible, though very unlikely, that the corpse of Hor, brother of Harwa, son of Tchaikonsarid and Tagenotep, adorns the walls of the Louvre to this day. By the beginning of the 20th century, people were treating mummified remains with a bit more respect. So the presence of one acquired through back channels in a respectable Cork institution like the Society for African Missions was definitely a potential embarrassment. In 1928, they donated it to the University College, but it wasn't publicised, and only a note in the archives implicates them. It was placed in the university's private medical museum with no details on its provenance. But in 1941, when William O'Donovan took over as Professor of Pathology and inherited the mysterious mummy, he had no idea where it had come from. As described by his wife, Dr. Mary O'Donovan, also a pathologist, to avoid awkward questions, he hid it under the floorboards of the pathology lecture theatre. For 30 years, students sat through their lectures with no idea what was under their feet. In 1970, when the pathology buildings were being renovated, the mummy was moved to the Lee Maltings building. This is not named after some Professor Maltings of years gone by. Instead, it is called that because it's an old malting building, used to make malt barley for crafting beer and whiskey, and it's on the shore of the River Lee. In 1968, the university bought the building and converted it into a laboratory complex. Officially, it's called the Tyndall National Institute, but the old name still lingers on. The mummy remained stored there until 1988, when a postgraduate student named Helen Davis began researching it. At her request, it was moved to the Bull Library. Helen Davis presented her thesis in 1990, and it was published in the Journal of the Cork Historical and Archaeological Society. Around this time, she became the custodian of the special collections at the Bull Library. In 1993, she arranged to show the mummy at the Cork Public Museum as part of an exhibition of ancient Egyptian artefacts, from the Nile to the Lee. However, after this, Hor's coffin and its occupant disappeared back into the university collection for another 30 years. In 2019, the Cork-born artist Dorothy Cross was looking for a new project. She was the niece of Mary O'Donovan, the pathologist who had told Helen Davis about her husband William hiding the mummy in the lecture theatre in 1941. Dorothy Cross had the idea of returning the mummy to Egypt and creating an artistic documentation of the process. The first thing to do was to track it down. According to Dorothy, she discovered that the mummy had been sent away from UCC for preservation treatment 12 years earlier. She assumed it had been sent to Dublin. When she went to visit a historical restoration expert near her home to get some advice on the project, she found out the mummy was not in Dublin. It was right there in that building. In fact, for the last 12 years it had been in storage within 5 miles of her house. Returning the mummy to Egypt was not simply a matter of putting it into a crate and shipping it over, of course. The Egyptian government has been looking to get back some of its more notable cultural treasures from abroad for decades. The Rosetta Stone, for example, was looted by Napoleon's soldiers during his invasion of Egypt in 1799. Nowadays it's held by the British Museum, who are no strangers to turning down the request to return their artefacts. UCC were far more willing to send the nameless ancient Egyptian home, since he had been doing little besides sitting in storage for decades, but it was still a diplomatic minefield that required experts to navigate. So they reached out to the Irish Foreign Ministry, who reached out to the Egyptian government, and the negotiations began. In March 2022, Dorothy Cross travelled to Cairo. With her went her producer Mary Hickson, her creative assistant Mae Van Austin, and the poet John Fitzgerald. There they met with Dr. Mustafa Waziri, Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities. He agreed to repatriate the mummy and take him into the Museum of Egyptology in Cairo, along with a collection of canopic jars that UCC also held. It took over 2.5 years until the mummy could be transported, though. There were bureaucratic hurdles to clear, with the Egyptian ambassador to Ireland having to get involved. There were logistical problems as well. Turned out the crate was too big for the plane that normally operated in a regular flight from Dublin to Cairo. Egypt Air had to move a plane from their Amsterdam route over to Dublin to fit it. But eventually, on December 12, 2024, 120 years after Schiaparelli's excavations, and over 2,000 years after his death, the nameless dead man finally returned to his homeland. Though that secret of the university has now left it, many others remain. One of the more surprising other things beneath the university is 2.5 tons of highly enriched uranium. It's classified as highly enriched because 20% or more of it is uranium-235, the isotope of uranium that can sustain a nuclear chain reaction. Uranium, where 85% or more is U-235, is called weapons grade, and is used to make nuclear bombs. The highly enriched uranium in UCC could technically be used to make a bomb, but would be very impractical. It's meant for use in a nuclear reactor, and that's what it was used for a while. In the decade after World War II, most people didn't know anything about nuclear energy. All they knew about was the bomb that had devastated 2 Japanese cities. Unbeknownst to the Americans, the Manhattan Project that created the bomb had been thoroughly infiltrated by Russian spies, so that by the war's end they also knew the bomb's capabilities and had blueprints for it. It took them time to source the raw materials in Russia and to develop specific technologies required, but in 1949 they detonated their first nuclear bomb. By August of 1953, they had developed their bombs to the point where they could be dropped from airplanes, just like the American ones. The US government knew that to maintain its status as a superpower, it would need to spend vast amounts of money on nuclear research, more than could be kept from the US public. So they launched Project Candor, an effort to educate people on the realities of living in the atomic age. Part of this was a series of 6-minute-long radio talks hosted by President Dwight D. Eisenhower himself, where he and various experts debated the communist threat and the need for Americans to stand against it. This all culminated in December of 1953, when President Eisenhower gave a speech to the UN. In it, the president acknowledged that atomic warfare was now a reality the world had to contend with. But he also claimed that atomic energy could change the world, and pledged to support nations in developing and using this new technology. They would provide equipment for research, as well as raw materials and knowledge. This was Atoms for Peace. It's true that this program did actually improve the world, especially in medical technology, with the vast number of ways doctors could use radiation to see inside the human body and to treat cancer. But it's also true that things were a bit more cynical than that. By making atomic energy a positive thing, Eisenhower found it easier to allocate money to research and develop nuclear weapons. And on a more practical level, his nuclear program required nuclear reactors to function. The weapons-grade uranium I mentioned earlier could only be made in a nuclear reactor. And it was a lot cheaper to use a reactor that was also generating electricity than one purpose-built to create the bomb material. This was why the government simultaneously subsidised the nuclear industry while maintaining a tight control over it. It was as part of Atoms for Peace that 2.5 tons of uranium arrived in Cork in 1974. Although Ireland has maintained a stance of official neutrality since it became a state, it has always been a bit more flexible in that neutrality when the United States were involved. The strong Irish-American tradition was one factor, as was the fact that Eamon de Valera, one of Ireland's founding fathers, was US-born. American warplanes refueled at Shannon Airport throughout the Cold War, and Ireland was one of the countries America donated nuclear research materials to. A small amount of plutonium came with the uranium. The uranium was used to set up a nuclear reactor on campus for research purposes, though this was all kept extremely secret. As for why UCC was chosen, probably because the only viable alternative would be to build it in the heart of Dublin, which would have been a lot trickier to manage. Cork was also once considered one of the safest places in Europe in the event of a nuclear war, at least according to an article in Esquire magazine in 1962. Legend has it that the Swiss government also planned to move some of their gold reserves there, until the plan leaked and they decided to abandon it. By later in the Cold War, this had changed. Ireland put its strategic oil reserve in Bantry Bay, and there was a landing area where American warships could have refueled. This made the southwest a target, but it might still have been considered safer than the alternatives at the time. Maybe we'll find out eventually what research the reactor was used for in the decade it was in use, but at the moment that remains classified. Might be that it was only ever used for training students in a live environment. It was a subcritical reactor, one of the safest kind that could not sustain its own reaction without a neutron source, and it had little chance of meltdown. It was disassembled in the 1980s, possibly as a result of history's most famous reactor meltdown. That was, of course, the Chernobyl disaster. A Soviet reactor near the city of Pripyat in Ukraine malfunctioned, melted down, and then exploded. It was not the first time a reactor of this sort had malfunctioned, but the Soviet culture of secrecy had covered up the previous problems. Chernobyl could not be covered up. The winds carried nuclear fallout all over Europe and Asia, setting off alarms at a Swedish reactor 600 miles away. The alarms were meant to detect problems of their own reactor. It took them some time to realize it was an external problem. All of this made Chernobyl a highly publicized international incident and galvanized opinion against nuclear reactors. Wouldn't be surprising if it prompted UCC to discontinue their own experiments. The uranium remained locked away in the basement of the science building. Officially, it was under the remit of the Nuclear Energy Board, a state body set up in 1973 to plan for setting up Ireland's first nuclear power station, Carnsore Point in Wexford. When that plan was shelved, the board faded into obscurity and was eventually replaced by the Radiological Protection Institute of Ireland in 1992. They took over the stewardship of the uranium in Cork, but with no nuclear disposal site in Ireland, and logistical problems and expense of shipping it out of the country, it just stayed in storage. It was still there in 1997 when the science building was renamed the Kane Building, after Robert Kane, the university's first president. The uranium remained a Cork urban legend until the 2000s, when the rise of internet discussion boards made tales like this a lot more public. In 2003, the university officially acknowledged the existence of the store in reaction to the rumours, but assured people that it was both secure and safe. In 2011, Cork TD Ciaran Lynch raised a question in the Dáil to then Education Minister Ruairí Quinn about the uranium. The minister assured him that the store was regularly inspected by the RPII, the EU, and the International Atomic Energy Agency. He said that the RPII and the university were hopeful that a resolution would be reached soon. But that resolution never came, and the uranium remains under tight security in the Kane Building's basement. In recent years, the university has been far more concerned with uranium ditelluride, the new superconductor it discovered in 2023, than the uranium under their feet. Those are the mysteries of University College Cork, at least those we know. And the other University of Ireland have their own mysteries as well. I look forward to talking to you about them all in the future. This has been Wild Old Times, a podcast about the stranger corners of Ireland and Irish history. The opening theme is The Cat That Ate the Candle. The closing theme is The Parting Glass. Both were recorded by Gregory Mahan and are used under a Creative Commons license. You can find more of Greg's music at tinwhistler.com. Our logo is by Liffy Designs. Wild Old Times is recorded at Farset Labs in Belfast. If you enjoyed the podcast, give it a review wherever you find it. It really does help the show. And if you really enjoyed it, tell your friends. Either way, I hope to see you again for another wild old time from Irish history.